Thank you very much for joining us, everyone. My name is Nabi Agzamov. I am an architect, an urban designer. I'm also leading a small team of urban ecologists at Strelka KB, which is a consultancy practice based in Moscow. Today we're going to continue the conversation about climate change and adaptation and mitigation. Today we're going to be talking about green infrastructure and climate resilience in New York. Please, someone write to me in the chat if you cannot hear me or you cannot see the presentation that I am about to share. Let me just, here we go. So, yeah, as already said, we are going to be talking about New York City and green infrastructure. And just to start off, a couple of disclaimers. First of all, I'm not representing the entire city of New York here or an architecture league of New York or something like this. The presentation is mainly based on my own experience living, studying, and practicing in New York. And this is more about, from my own perspective, what I've seen and the changes that I've seen take place during my time in the city. And also keep in mind that I've been in Moscow for past 3 years, so there might be a gap between the last events that took place within the world of green infrastructure resilience in New York and my kind of up-to-date knowledge. So, but I think this is going to be a sort of an introduction to the topic and the things that led to this practice being kind of developed in the city. So, well, to start off, from my own experience, to just give you an idea where I stand and things like this, I received my Bachelor's of Architecture in New York City at New York Institute of Technology, as well as my Master's in Urban Design and Architecture at Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. I had a chance to work at an architecture firm there, and as well as a landscape architecture firm. And issues of green infrastructure and climate change and resilience were a very much the topic during this time, right? So to start the presentation, when we talk about New York and think about New York, we often kind of imagine ourselves this big mega city with high skyscrapers, the tallest skyscrapers in the world, and lots of cars, the city of the future, let's say, right? And then this was sort of the vision of the future from many architects, visionaries or designers that we've seen were formed in the past century, right? The previous century, starting out from like early 1900s with a picture on the left where we see again like the tallest skyscrapers flying, not cars at that moment, but like planes, and then the idea that the planes could possibly park at a skyscraper and people can like get in and get off. Then we're seeing this, again, the idea of tall skyscrapers and multi-layered kind of planes of infrastructure on the street level. And the same thing kind of continues on into the mid-century. Very much when we, as architects, right, when architects thought of the future in the past century or the mid-20th century, they envisioned this city where everybody has a car and we all live on skyscrapers and we kind of zooming around between them, and that was like the vision of the progressive future that we all imagined for ourselves. And unfortunately, the future that we actually got is not like a total opposite of that, but it's drastically different, which is the reality of climate vulnerability. And especially in New York City, a coastal city, which is highly vulnerable to sea level rise, hurricanes, and other climate change ramifications. In this picture, you see the island of Manhattan, which lost its power during Hurricane Sandy. And there was even like, I think, Bjarke Ingels, one of the architects, famous architects, made this joke that where in New York City we had Soho and NoHo and all of these abbreviations for neighborhoods, the south of Houston Street, north of Houston Street. And in this moment, a new neighborhood arose, which was SoPo, or like south of power. So you saw that, well, people in the city after this event realized how much the city is actually unprepared to the new realities, new climate realities. And I was actually in the city when Sandy hit New York, the superstorm Sandy. And we've kind of seen how streets were flooded, train stations, subway stations were flooded underwater. Many neighborhoods, especially on Staten Island, which is one of the boroughs of New York, or Red Hook, or Brooklyn, some parts of Queens, were completely devastated by this event, where a tide was hitting residential areas, and infrastructure was not kind of prepared for any of this. And there were a lot of questions about what could have been done differently to avoid the situation, or what should be done in the future in order for the city not to find itself in a situation like this again. And if you actually look at, in this case, the borough of Manhattan or South Manhattan, what you actually can notice is that on the left, we see an image of the island of Manhattan, which was the original name of Manhattan. And in the middle, we see with the orange outline or the orange fill, how much of the land was actually built out, or how much it was kind of claimed from the water, right? And then the coastline was expanded outwards. And if we would overline that with the image on the right, which shows us the footprint of Hurricane Sandy, right, what it flooded, we realize that water tend to go there what it used to be before. Right, a lot of this landscape used to be wetlands and littoral intertidal landscape, right, where the idea of the hard edge between water and land did not exist. And during Sandy, during this hurricane event, we saw that areas that once used to be either water or marshland or wetland were flooded. Right, and a lot of this, you can argue that lies in the way we think about our coastlines and the traditional kind of maybe engineered-based thinking about water and land is that there is a specific line that we can see, well, starting out from a map that separates water and land. Right, and on this famous image on the map, on the screen right now, which is the Mississippi River Survey, right, by Harold Fisk, where we see many kind of depictions of the river at different periods of time. We can see how hard it is to say where exactly the water is and when the land begins. Right, it's a very dynamic and a living thing that constantly changing its location, and it's almost impossible to say where is the land and where is the water. because there is almost no such thing in this landscape, right? And we often forget about this space, which is not necessarily a line, but a gradient, right? When we forget about that space, and then we design on this kind of misconception that there is a very specific physical line, a border between water and land. And what we do is then physically reinforce this line, right, by building a big infrastructural projects like levees or dams that start physically separating us from water. But what happens when you build this physical barrier, you kind of create this one layer of defense sort of approach. And when this one layer of defense, in this case, the levee or the dam, breaks or fails, then the entire system behind it becomes vulnerable. And it kind of a reminder for us that there is no such line that separates water and land, and we are only sort of imagining it, and then we're trying to reinforce it, base our projects on it, big infrastructural, large urban projects. And then at some point we can realize that the water really does not recognize this line. This line does not exist. And then when the water crosses the line, we call this an event as a flood. All right. I had a very great professor at Columbia. His name is Dilip Dakunha, and he talked about exactly that, right? This imaginary line that doesn't really exist, and then there is no separation between water and land. There's a gradient, and he has an amazing book which is called The Invention of the River, right? He also has this great saying that there is no such thing as a natural disaster, there's only design disasters. So an alternative approach, right? You might be asking yourself, what is the alternative approach? How can we design our waterfronts, our coastal lines that are not based on this idea of a separation between land and water? And I think a good example of such approach could be seen at the work at this exhibition, which took place in the Modern Museum of Art in New York. It was called Rising Currents, that happened in 2009. Where basically the New York Harbor was separated into 5 areas, and these areas were given to different landscape architecture firms or landscape designers to reimagine this space, right? The relationship of the city to water. And very much keeping in mind the realities of climate change and the sea level rise. And I'm going to be just talking about a couple of them. I won't be going into all of them. I think the ones that I really liked were, first of all, one called New Urban Grounds by D-Land Studio, which is a landscape architecture firm based in New York. And the vision here for the Lower Manhattan was based on the idea that rather than keeping water out of the city and not letting it in, or getting the water out of the city as fast as possible, right? Our traditional, maybe even like the traditional kind of industrial way of thinking about water infrastructure, right? We need to control it. We need to control it with pipes. We need to prevent it entering the city with walls, etc. Based on this, again, idea of a hard line, hard edge between these two entities. So they were talking about letting water inside of the city, right? But letting it through the areas and spaces where they already know where it would go, right? And create the space for water entering the city and letting water out of the city easily, and also thinking about how these spaces could be multifunctional. So in this case, we see how these streets and squares and pedestrian infrastructure could be sort of part of the stormwater management, right? Or dealing with rain, essentially, leading rain into stormwater infrastructure, but also kind of holding it and filtrating it, right? Relieving the stress or like the pressure off the river and off the infrastructure. During heavy rains, it can kind of absorb and hold this water. And also during kind of dry weather or like sunny weather, it could be used as public spaces. And also they were talking about rethinking this hard edge of Lower Manhattan, right? Instead of having this kind of a border, specific border between, again, New York Harbor and the city, you have this gradient, the intertidal landscape, a littoral landscape that can be restored and be used as a public space and be a habitat, kind of the wetland area that can become sort of not necessarily as a nuisance as maybe can be seen again in a traditional urban planning engineering way, where previously cities were tend to kind of dry these wetlands in order to reclaim the land and develop it and build on it, but see it as an asset and maybe a destination point, a place where you can go, where you can learn about the environment, and that can protect you during a storm event, right? Can absorb this hurricane heat hit during an event like a Sandy. Another interesting project at this exhibition was called Oyster Texture by firm SCAPE. Oyster Texture, it's like two words put together, oyster and architecture. And they were looking at the area of Governor's Island and Red Hook, where they were talking about creating a multifunctional infrastructure, flood resilient infrastructure that would protect the neighborhood and at the same time be a space for habitat and also public space, right? They were talking about this kind of structure where oysters could grow on each other and then kind of become breakwaters, right? So when the tide is rushing towards the shoreline or coastline, this infrastructure or the living breakwaters could break the impact of the wave, which we can see here, and then by that protect the coastline, and at the same time be part of the public realm and the public space, as well as kind of promote habitat in the area. So here we can kind of see the close-up of this project. And again, seeing this wetland area or oyster habitat as a place of public space, right? So when these projects that I mentioned, the oyster texture and the new urban grounds, there were sort of conceptual visions for the coastline or the shoreline, and not necessarily actual projects that would take place. They sort of, in my mind, paved the way for other projects in the future. And the importance of them is that they actually took place prior to Sandy. So when Sandy hit, a lot of people were kind of asking architects what to do now and how to protect our shorelines and etc. When a lot of the times the answers were actually behind landscape architects and landscape designers. that already were talking about issues such as sea level rise and flood resiliency, and etc., living infrastructure. So here we can see that these ideas were already on the table prior to sending, and after sending, the city and the state were conducting an international competition, which was called Rebuild by Design, where they the approach looked very similar to Rising Currents, where the New York Harbor and parts of New Jersey coastline were kind of divided into areas that different architects, different landscape architects and urban designers were kind of reimagining in order to meet and then be ready for this new climate reality. And I'm just going to be talking about just a few of them again, right? Well, I think one of the most famous ones is the big U that used to be called Dry Line. Kind of, you had a famously, if you know, this park in Manhattan, which is called High Line, and this was kind of play on words with this, with a dry line, right? Keeping the island dry. And essentially, it was a linear infrastructure project that worked as a levee, and the purpose of it was not to let water inside of Lower Manhattan. But unlike many typical levees, it was obviously not just a wall, right? Or a simple separation or infrastructure that was keeping water out of the city. A lot of effort was done in order to kind of fill this space with different architectural programs or activities, public spaces, also restore wetlands in some areas, additional green infrastructure, etc., floodable spaces. So it was very much a multi-layered project, but it still received some of criticism because in the core it was still sometimes seen as a levee project, right? And maybe you could argue that the approach needed to be taken here was similar to what D-Land Studio was doing, not exactly perhaps, but maybe the idea of learning how to live with water rather than trying to kind of separate yourself from it. This project is actually happening, not in exact shape and form as it was conceived, but still a lot of these areas are in the works as we speak. And another project that I wanted to talk to you about is the living breakwaters, which I think the roots of which go into the oyster texture project that we saw, right? Where oyster texture was a sort of a vision or a concept. Here we actually see a real pilot project. It's a large pilot project, but nonetheless a pilot project. And the idea of keeping the shoreline of Staten Island safe from events such as Hurricane Sandy, as well as create public space and habitat and restore this intertidal ecosystems, right? And the Staten Island is, once again, as I mentioned, one of the boroughs of New York City. It's a little bit on the south part, a little bit south from Manhattan. And the idea here, obviously, cannot describe this great project and all of the details, but the idea here, I think, is that the project was not just seen as a site-specific, but also as, in a way, a prototype that could have been or could be replicated on other parts of the coastline, right? Where Here we see the units that serve both as a part of protective infrastructure or flood resilient infrastructure, and part of the habitat and the public space, and this kind of a multi-layered approach of flood resiliency. And this project is under construction currently. And if to kind of just give you an idea how long can projects can take, let's say in Russia versus US, I've seen this project being a student pursuing my bachelor's of architecture, and I kind of stumbled upon it during after sending, when we were researching projects that were dealing with flood resiliency and ecological remediation, and that was I don't know, around 2012, 2013, and the actual construction on the project started just several months ago, right? So maybe not even a year, the construction of it. So it was a long time, kind of a long process, but I think it was in the end worth it. And I cannot wait to see what happens next and how it would be scaled up and replicated across the rest of the intertidal regions of the United States. So another thing is just to give you an idea that when we speak of green infrastructure or resiliency, we don't just talk about the large scale projects, right? Like we saw with the previous visions, but also a scale of a street, for example, right? Or a building. And the projects that kind of fall within the realm of green infrastructure, very much multi-scale approach. And in this case, the reason for it, for example, or one of the issues that it would address is what is called combined sewer outflow. So in the cities like New York City or Boston, where infrastructure was built 19th century, a lot of the times the stormwater management or the stormwater infrastructure is interlinked, right, connected. So when the rain falls, it's essentially going into the same pipe that let's say whatever comes out of the building goes, right? So during a normal or like a sunny weather, you have kind of not overloading infrastructure, and essentially it goes into the water treatment plant, right? Whatever comes out of the buildings. And during rain or heavy rain, the system can overflow and essentially be released into the river, right? And the way the system was constructed at that time, the idea of a heavy rain was very different from the current understanding of a heavy rain. So the heavy rain that New Yorkers are experiencing today is almost every rain, right? And almost every time it rains in the city pollutes its rivers and water streams, right? So waterways. So basically you have this combined sewer outflow sprinkled around the coastline of Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, etc. And every time it rains, you have kind of an outflow of sewage, raw sewage going into the rivers. So a big problem is how do you deal with this? You kind of have two approaches here. Either dig this all up and make the infrastructure larger with the large kind of pipes so it can handle more amount of sewage coming in, or you build another layer of infrastructure, a green infrastructure that would hold this extra water, right, and filtrate it as well, in order to kind of give some time to the existing gray infrastructure to kind of take care of this pressure, essentially. So when we're talking about green infrastructure on a city scale, you have to be talking about different typologies of it on a smaller scale. And just imagining how rain falls in the city, it falls on the streets, it falls on the roofs, it falls on the parks, the squares, parking lots, etc. So all of these kind of surfaces or typologies of surfaces have to have an approach of this additional layer of green infrastructure. So for the roofs, for example, it could be a green roof or a blue roof, basically a layer or multi-layered cake that holds this stormwater runoff or rain, essentially, giving the time for green infrastructure to take care of the water on the street. And on the street, you create permeable paving systems. So rather than kind of having this large concrete slabs or impenetrable asphalt, you try to create as much permeable surfaces as possible. So surfaces that allow water go through it, right? And then recharge groundwater essentially in the long run. And as well as additional bioswales or bioretention cells or rain gardens, as some call it, as like spaces where water would accumulate and kind of hold, giving some time for gray infrastructure to take care of the rain and filtrate it, recharge groundwater, and through evapotranspiration, cool down area around it. So there are multiple issues that this approach kind of addresses at the same time. So the issues of urban heat island effect. So this means that when we built our environment out of asphalt, concrete, as you can imagine, a city that we saw on the first slide would look like, right? That accumulates a lot of heat and holds it during hot summer days. This area needs to be cooled down because people with heart disease issues or elderly cannot necessarily withstand this amount of pressure during hot July days. So the infrastructure that could help to cool down the city is green infrastructure. And at the same time, it helps you to kind of slow down stormwater runoff and help green infrastructure deal with the existing reduced amounts of water, kind of reducing or protecting water streams from water polluting. And at the same time, on a larger scale, it can serve as a flood mitigation infrastructure, right? That protects the city from flood events, and also be utilized as a public space and also be a habitat and address issues of biodiversity. So you see how you're kind of tackling multiple problems at the same time. So it's no wonder that New York City is actively approaching this direction and implementing this kind of design decisions at different scales in different boroughs. So just to give you a couple of concrete examples or examples of what I'm talking about actually built as prototypes in this case. This is D-Land Studio, a vision of which we saw previously with the new urban grounds, the a vision of, let's say, water resilient or flood resilient New York, Lower Manhattan. So here we see a group of people standing under an elevated highway stormwater runoff from which is going down this drain pipe, and before the installment of this pilot project was just entering the landscape and infiltrating into the groundwater really unfiltered. And during heavy rains, it would actually start flooding this area. So this project was aimed at slowing the water down, first of all, and holding it, and as well as filtrating it through the processes of phytoremediation. So essentially, the water would go down the drain pipe, enter this bioretention cell, be slowed down there, filter out, and then exit and enter the ground, and basically further recharge groundwater levels. Another pilot project that they worked on was called Gavanas Canal Sponge Park. And the sponge park, as a terminology, kind of entered the mainstream now, and we talk about sponge cities now and sponge waterfronts and etc. It was actually kind of coined by Susanna Drake, the founder of Dylan Studio, and in this case, this is an area in Red Hook, Brooklyn, and this is a Gavanas Canal. So prior to installment of this pilot project, stormwater runoff would kind of go down the street, which is perpendicular to the canal, and enter canal unfiltered, taking with it all of the oils and cigarette butts and garbage that were on the street. So Dylan Studio was talking about what if there was kind of a multi-layered system that would, first of all, filter out all of the larger garbage, and then filter out the surface runoff itself, slow it down, and then it would enter Gavanas as a cleaner water now, right? So preventing it from further contamination by stormwater runoff. And this was actually built, and now it's a small little public space where you could go to and have a nice time, and knowing that this area also serves as a part of the city's infrastructure, right? So this multi-layered and multi-purpose approach to landscape, essentially, which is in the core of green infrastructure. And at the same time, it was not just like a pilot project that was created in isolation from the rest of the canal. It was part of a larger vision for all of Gavanas. And the idea here being that if there were parks like this alongside the coastline or like waterfront here and be interlinked, you could have essentially a continued public space that connects all of these neighborhoods, and at the same time acts as a protective buffer from water pollution, right? And protects Gavanas essentially from further contamination by surface runoff, and kind of takes pressure from the existing stormwater infrastructure, kind of letting it deal with reduced amounts of water, reducing the chance of combined sewage outflow during heavy rains. So this is pretty much all I have. I think if there are any questions, I could maybe answer them. Okay, comment from Tammy Sue. Very interesting. Thank you so much. You very welcome, Tammy. Question from Tammy: are other cities beside New York working on this green infrastructure, or countries? Very much so. In general, in the United States, you can see kind of this a huge wave of interest in this approach in both Northeast and kind of Southwest, and really like all around the country, because flood mitigation is very much a topic of conversation right now. If we talk about riverine flooding, right, in case, for example, of Mississippi, where it may flood cities, and traditional approach there would be building a levee or a dam to protect a city from the river. So now they're actually seeing that this approach is actually causing even more flooding, because this water that could not enter one area because it was kind of restricted to a direct narrowed path, would flood the next city even more, right? So, which is just basic physics, I guess. So the approach is that of a setback of like bringing the levees back into the inland and kind of restoring wetlands, utilizing wetlands as another layer of flood mitigation, or flood resiliency. Also thinking about sea level rise, right, on all of the coastal cities across the United States, where the idea of can we create spaces that could be flooded during hurricane events and be used as maybe public spaces during dry weather. So, and but I think before US, this concept of this approach was maybe starting out in Europe, especially Netherlands, because Netherlands famously is pretty much built below sea level and on the marshlands. And it has a very kind of interesting story of, first of all, reclaiming the wetlands and then building and developing them. And then now thinking about ways of living with water and more in harmony with water. And there's a famous project which is called Room for the River, where they're essentially doing pretty much what they're doing on the Mississippi River, where they're giving more space to the water, right? And just this act alone becomes an effective approach to dealing with sea level rise and floods, essentially. So it's really kind of taking place, or projects like this take place all around the globe now. The important thing to remember is that it's not a copy-paste approach, and should not be a copy-paste approach. You have to keep in mind that the different landscapes, different ecosystems, and it has to be more site-specific. But the principles, or like the main ideas, can stay the same, right? Rather than trying to combat the nature, like control it, really. Accept that you will never be able to fully control nature, and try to find ways of living with it, right? And many times answers to these questions lie in the ways people used to live with water or waterscapes prior to industrialization or modernization of urban environment, prior to this idea that building a kind of this hard line between water and land was the only way to go, or like a sign of progress. So now we see kind of the idea of how do we bring back some of these ecosystems, how do we find maybe even sometimes traditional ways of dealing with restoring the relationship between landscapes and urban environment. So, okay, question from why, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your names. Question from why Valeri, green infrastructure is more costly than conventional infrastructure. How many people are willing to pay for green infrastructure? There's a growing demand for it. So yeah, so the question of the price is often discussed during these projects. And I think, first of all, you have to keep in mind that in the long term, it will be cheaper. If you counting like I spent this much dollars right now on the pipe versus I spend this much dollars if I dig something up and then create a multi-layered kind of soil bed and then have perforated pipes on that. So it seems like in the beginning there's more investment into that, but you have to keep in mind all of the additional effects, right? It has this type of infrastructure it has, and they're not always you cannot always put a dollar sign on it, right? So at least in US, the conversation starts beginning to look like that more about the values rather than the price, right? So what are the additional effects we have from an investment into this infrastructure, right? So social effects, environmental effects, positive effects, right? Rather than looking at it as simply from a kind of an Excel point of view where you have this is cheaper than that and I'm buying that. So you have to keep in mind the long-term kind of big picture, also the idea of flood resiliency, and also keep in mind that by investing into something that can be used all year round, right, as a public space and as a flood resilient infrastructure, you're essentially saving money, right, rather than building something that only is utilized during a flood event, like a dam or a levee, which kind of functions during that small period of time and then remains underutilized. So thinking about putting as many uses into this investment could be an effective approach, and also thinking of what are additional values and effects we're getting from it. So yes, the price is kind of a hot topic, but essentially in the long term, I think it is more, it's a better investment than a simple gray infrastructure. And we can see that more and more cities and countries are realizing that, and that's why we're seeing more investment into projects like this. Because, well, if it would not make sense economically, they would probably not be financed eventually. So, okay, are city dwellers getting involved in urban design in New York City? I think yes. Well, you have to keep in mind that obviously there are many millions of people live in the city, and I don't know if everybody is involved or like the majority of it involved, but there is of course cases of public participation and the participatory kind of approaches. And then I think the more successful landscape architecture firms or like design firms are working with public. So and then this really became kind of almost the only way to go, right? To include the public, involve the public, not only into analysis portion of the project, but also thinking how some of the processes that are happening within the communities can also become then part of the project itself going forward. So, for example, with project by SCAPE with the oyster texture, another parallel initiative that was taking place was called Billion Oysters. And that was an educational program where high school on Governor's Island, it is marine high school, where students kind of go into the harbor and kind of learn about navigating the waters and about the ecosystem, etc. They also are involved in an initiative of planting or like deploying billion oysters around New York Harbor, because what oysters are doing, they're essentially also cleaning water, purifying the water. You cannot actually eat them during this process, but they become an important part of this infrastructure. And you can see how this initiative kind of involved the community into not just one town hall meeting or like a community meeting, but it became part of their daily exercises. So in short, there are ways where public can participate in urban design projects, and successful firms, successful designers are implementing this ways and constantly thinking about new ways how public can be engaged in projects like this beyond just a typical community meeting. So, okay. Question from Dmitry Churlyaev. Thanks a lot. Do you know any examples of implementation of such incredible, hold on, sorry. Such incredible green buildings technologies in Russia? Well, the place where I work, Strelka KB, I'm actually working with urban ecologists here, and we are constantly consulting project teams on the issues and questions of green infrastructure and etc. And we always are advocating for utilization of such tools and solutions. So yes, we are in the works, both on the kind of conceptual phases, vision phases, and some of the projects are actually under construction, let's say. But overall, you see that there is a small of a gap or a lag behind other large cities like New York. If you look at the amounts of like quantities of the projects, right? So there are definitely fewer of them here than like in New York City. But you also have to keep in mind that New York, prior to Sandy, was very much behind other cities when it came to green infrastructure as well. So what it took for the city to kind of wake up and start investing and implementing that was Hurricane Sandy, and more recently Hurricane Ida. I was not there when that hurricane took place, but as far as I understand it, kind of only reinforced the idea that the city needs to be more resilient and invest into green infrastructure, living infrastructure, etc. Okay, I have, I think, 3 last questions. Are those examples of countries that have taken the example of New York in green building design? Okay, are there examples of countries that have said? I'm kind of having trouble understanding this question about the green building design. Maybe you can retype the question. Next question, Mikhail Zonov. Alongside with your Sandy examples, I thought of Venice, which is drowning now. Are there any big projects in Italy? How much harder is it to work with bigger wet places such as Venice? I think, well, first of all, I am no expert of Venice Lagoon, so I would not be able to kind of give you same amount of information as in the case with New York. But I think essentially, when we are dealing with cities or larger places, what you have to keep in mind is that they do not exist in isolation from surrounding ecosystems, and they're very much part of larger regions, ecological regions, right? And then in Venice, it's a Venetian lagoon, which is much larger than just the Venice, the way we kind of picture it on the map. And there are, of course, a lot of initiatives taking place of restoring the intertidal landscapes and protecting the city at the same time. Unfortunately, I cannot give you much more examples and details, although I did participate in the project for the design of US Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, not the last one, but the one before that, where we actually exactly spoke about that, the idea of an intertidal region. And the theme of the pavilion was dimensions of citizenships, the dimension of citizenship. And it was kind of inspired by this, the idea of the powers of 10, or like the scaling up. So we had different firms and different designers tackling or investigating concepts of citizenship in different scales, starting out from like a person to cosmos or a region, right? And then our scale was region, and we spoke about the idea of that a region can not necessarily be defined as a political looped geometry on the map, but be defined by a landscape or an ecosystem. And ecological regions that we looked at was an intertidal region, right? Littoral landscape where water comes and goes, exactly the idea of the gradient that I spoke about in the beginning. And then there we spoke about people who were fighting to preserve these landscapes, which were our ecological citizens. And we depicted the materials or the tools that are under their disposal, which included core logs and fashions and concrete units. Essentially, things. It's like you need another lecture to talk about this entire project and the fashions or core logs. But essentially, it's units of infrastructure that could be implemented in order to restore wetlands into tidal landscapes. And after the Biennale, they were actually deployed in the Venetian lagoon. So I do have some experience working with this landscape, but there are much more qualified experts in this area, certainly. So, okay, questions. The Maldives are near at the sea level. I know even less about Maldives than about Venice. Is there any green technology infrastructure project there? Thanks again. So needed and interesting. Yes, unfortunately, I will not be able to tell you, but also keep in mind that, again, these projects should be site-specific. They should be addressing the issues of this particular landscape and the communities. I really shouldn't talk about a landscape or a site which I'm not familiar with, because I'm sure there are experts that spend more time kind of researching it and developing their own kind of project based on site specifics, right? So, yeah. If you have a question about New York or US, I would be happy to answer that one. Let's hope that, so the comment, let's hope that the US and Russia other countries can work on this amazing technology together. That would be great, actually. Thinking about some international alliances when it comes to green infrastructure, where different experience could be shared. Because if we, for example, one of the misconceptions when we talk about green infrastructure in Russia, specifically when it comes to green roofs, for example, the misconception is that green roofs do not survive winter, right? And it only works in the countries or cities where there is no winter, which is false. And there are successful examples in the cities in US and Canada where green roofs are feeling pretty comfortable during the winter months. And if there would be some kind of association or a network of experts, international landscape experts, let's say, that could exchange their knowledge and information, experience beyond maybe than just a presentation like this, where we can actually go in deeper and talk about what were the issues at some specific project, and how they were tackled, and etc. So that would be kind of a great way to approach this issue. What other cities in US have a green infrastructure? I think I did answer this question. It's pretty much being spread throughout all of larger cities, and not even that large across the United States. It has proven, a lot of cities are doing studies on what is more effective, kind of traditional stormwater management systems versus green infrastructure. And these studies are showing that if you look by square footage, it's much more efficient to have green infrastructure because it captures more stormwater, and it costs less in maintenance in the long term, etc. So kind of maybe this becomes one of the reasons why it becomes popular among other cities, but in many larger cities in the United States, you do have green infrastructure plans that become kind of not only sort of suggestions or designs, but also kind of guidelines and part of the zoning regulations. So, and this is really the only way to have an effect on the city, right? So the projects that I showed you, the pilot projects, etc., they are great in their own right. But if we do want to have a kind of a larger scale effect and have effects spread throughout the entire city, typologies, as I showed before, with the bioswales and green roofs, etc., they have to become part of the zoning regulations and guidelines. So they would be implemented in the city, not as kind of a cool feature, but part of whole city infrastructure. Okay. How hard is it for a city to switch to a more sustainable urban design? Hurricane helped New York, but how can old cities like St. Petersburg have a greener design? So the difficulty is more about maybe mindsets. A lot of the times when we are trying to implement something like this, you have to deal with, first of all, the party that is commissioning the project. Then you have to deal with the community, the public, and the engineers. So you sort of have to, first of all, raise the awareness among the public that there is an alternative to stormwater management and issues like this. And it doesn't have to be always something made out of concrete or a big thing that will just save the entire city at once. It could be a multi-layered approach. Then the public, in ideal scenario, kind of applies pressure onto the decision makers, and then the decision makers are more interested in projects like that. And then you also have to collaborate with engineers and have collaborating with engineers with more like open mind. And sometimes it can also be a challenge when you have a very kind of old school way of dealing with a project, right? Where kind of an old school engineer way of dealing with a problem is that there's a problem and there's a solution. And usually the solution as big as the problem, right? So if there is a flood area or flood prone area, right? Then if it's this big, then it means that we have to have this big of a wall. And sometimes it could be a challenge to kind of work on projects that could challenge that, but I do believe it sort of starts with the public, then the public applies the pressure on the decision makers, and then the decision makers apply the pressure on the engineers, and we as designers collaborate with all of them in order to kind of create this multifunctional, multi-layered projects. Okay, so, but let's hope that a city like St. Petersburg would not be waiting for its own Hurricane Sandy in order to implement projects like that. The good news is that physically, construction-wise, it's not the most difficult thing, because many times it does not mean green infrastructure does not mean replacing something, but rather than being an addition to something, right? It's always adding to something, being an extra layer to something. So it can only be a replacement of something that is not yet existed, right? So for example, if there's a plan for a huge dam or something, maybe the conversation could be had about an alternative approach, and then replace that non-existing yet project with another approach. So this is the only way where it could like replace something. But if there is already an established and existing urban environment, it does not mean that it would be replacing something. It would only add an additional layer with additional functions that it would have. How hard is it? Okay. From Mikhail Zonov again, thank you very much. That is really a topic for a whole single lecture. Thank you for your answer and interest in the presentation. Okay, so I think this is all. Thank you so much for joining us again. I really hope to continue this conversation if you're interested, and answer any other questions if you had any. So thank you so much again for joining us, and I think we'll be out. Bye. Have a good evening, everyone.